Well,
Yeah, let's do this since we're all sitting down
do you
here.
know where we're drawing? We're drawing from your post on October
19th.
19th
Yep.
about Mark Driscoll.
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
mean, you wrote it, so you probably remember publishing it.
I do.
But before we get to that, I did want to try to. I'm not going to presume that all of our listeners know who you are. Well,
Yep.
two or three of our listeners. So I did
Sure.
want to introduce you and then allow you to correct me. Or you can add, like, you don't know my dog named Sparkles or whatever you want to add to. But I'm going to
Sure.
do a real quick little intro. This is Israel Wayne, friend of ours.
For a lot of years.
Actually, we've stayed at his house,
And
but
he stayed at our house.
he stayed at our house. But to many, he is a noted author, published many books with primarily master books, right?
Correct.
Used to have your own publishing house with family, but you transitioned to master books, I think, entirely, right? And Israel Wayne is a very noted conference speaker. I don't know how many conferences have you done at this point?
I have spoken at over 600.
600 conferences over 20, 30
30
years? How
years.
many? 30
Yep, 30
years.
years.
So Israel Wayne is very well heeled in the conference circuit. A lot of the guys I think that I wanted to talk about, probably maybe you've even met them or spoken on conferences with some of these guys, right? Phillip Yancey, Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll, maybe not a conference speaker, but certainly he tries to be. I guess he went to the Shepherd's Conference a couple of years ago and tried to set up a booth without being invited. Is
Oh,
that,
Mark Driscoll did, yeah.
that's one way to start the conference circuit. But anyways, so Israel's for us, he's a friend, but for many out there, he's a well-noted published author, Christian leader. I know you don't like to say you always say I'm not a pastor, I'm not a pastor, but definitely a leader. A lot of the guys that we can talk about in the last year that have sort of fallen down on after many decades of ministry. Ravi Zacharias, so many names. Steve Lawson, not a pastor, right? Like you, but well noted, working for a big name,
Ministry,
big ministry name,
written books, and that sort of.
written lots of books. So I think one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about some of these guys, and I do want you to talk a little bit more about Mark Driscoll since that's the post we talked about. But I want to kind of use him as a jumping, a launch pad for maybe we can ruminate on like what is with this generation of leaders or what is with is this every generation?
Mm.
I'm sure we can find leaders in scripture who are legitimate Christian leaders who fall and we just
Hmm.
I was just preaching through Genesis and Abraham, he's 75 years old and he's lying about his relationship to his wife. So it's not that sin is like outside of our capacity as
Hmm.
Christians, but maybe these guys aren't even Christians and they're just playing one on TV or, in the public
Yeah.
eye.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of the I thought Israel was uniquely qualified because you met a lot of these people. Maybe you even have some like thoughts of your own that you've formed over decades. Like, wow,
Yeah.
this is what I've noticed. So why don't you take it away and correct me on, or add to, I know you have a lovely wife, Brooke, kids, anything else you want to add to
Yeah.
introduce yourself?
Well, I think what's most relevant to this particular topic is kind of my upbringing in one sense, in that my mother started a Christian publishing company in 1988. And it's amazing. She ended up publishing three national magazines, published books, and I started working for her in January of '93 and was marketing director for the publishing company, and then was actually kind of business manager there for a long time. And so I worked there 20 years. And one of the things I found that's interesting is that when you publish magazines and you have a platform, that you attract friends. And
Hmm.
so there were many, many people who wanted to be, especially my mother's friend, because she was the editor and made the editorial decisions. And so um, there were a lot of authors that we met, and we used to go to trade shows, Christian Booksellers Convention and National Religious Broadcasters. In fact, I think Elysse, you went with us to a Christian Booksellers conference one time, at least
Couple
once.
times, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe a
Yeah.
couple times. And so you spend time around these people, and some of them you actually get to know. Um, Man, I think that it just is interesting to me how there is a phoniness and a fakiness with a lot of them. And then, of course, many are just wonderful, genuine, godly people. And it's this odd disparity to try to figure out what makes one this way and the other one this other way, right? There will probably be some people that I'll name and some that I won't. But I remember in the late 1980s, a real eye-opening thing for me was there was a guy who had a television show and mostly a national radio show. I can't remember where he lived, but his name was Bob Larsen, and he had this show called
Mm.
Talk Back with Bob Larsen, and it was one of the top, like talk call-in talk shows on Christian radio. And he in the late 80s had gotten into like exorcisms and things like that. And so allegedly they would have people who would call and manifest demons on the air, and it's a real sensational kind of show. And I remember watching him film a live TV video recording at National Religious Broadcasters in Washington, D.C. It's like maybe 1988, 89. And he had like an Episcopalian priest on a panel, and this guy was I think identified as LGBTQ and was gay affirming and all that kind of thing. Well, in 1988 or 89, that was
Wow.
like
That's
not heard
pretty
of. Like nobody's doing
shocking.
that in the Christian
Yeah.
community. And so Bob Larsen is attacking this guy on the air, and just after him, tearing him down, and they're debating, and they're having this real heated, controversial debate. And and
Mm.
then at the end of the show, he goes up to this Episcopalian guy and he's like, "Hey man, sorry about that. Hey, you got to do it for the cameras, and hope I wasn't too rough on you." And the guy's like, "Oh no, I'm used to it." And he's like, "So where are we going for dinner?" It's just like, oh, that switched. And then while they're still there,
Wow.
there was this Christian comedian named Mike Warnke, who had written this best-selling book called like The Satan Cellar, I think, and told the story about how supposedly he had been a satanic high priest, and then he had converted to Christianity and become a pastor, and then became a comedian and all this kind of thing. And the two of them, like Mike Warnke was walking past, and they give each other this big bear hug, and they're like, "Hey brother, yeah, let's get together," and all this. And I could tell like, oh, they're super friends, which is kind of odd because I would have just never put those two together. But then you find out later that like Larsen's having an affair. He had
Wow.
all kinds of financial scandals. Mike Warnke ends up later having his own scandal with lots of money issues, and then found out like he wasn't into Satanism at all. He just made all of that up to be able to sell something. And and these are people who have huge platforms and pack out concert. I went and saw as a teenager. I went and saw Mike Warnke in a concert. And he's talking to 1,000 people doing a comedy concert, and so these are the kinds of things that I was exposed to even as a teenager, and got to see a little bit behind the curtain with some of these
Hmm.
folks.
Okay.
But then on the other hand, met some wonderful people. Like one of my heroes that I always loved as a teenager was Warren Wiersbe, who was the host of the show out of Lincoln, Nebraska, called Back to the
Yeah, he's
Bible.
legit.
And he was at National
I hope
Religious
you don't tell me
Broadcasters. And I
anything bad
remember
about Warren Wiersbe because I still have him on a pedestal.
yeah, see, this show's not going to be safe, right?
Oh
Everybody's going to be
no.
like, "Oh no, don't ruin my heroes." But I remember I went up to Warren Wiersbe and I just said, "Hey man, I'm such a big fan of your show. I listen to it all the time." And he was like, "You listen to my show?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Why?" And I was like, "Well, because I learn a lot, and I think you're a good Bible teacher." And he said, I had no idea that someone your age was listening to me. He said, I guess I always thought it was like old people, that sat around and listened to my show." So he
Yeah.
said, "Who are you?" But anyway, he spent probably 10, 15 minutes just standing there talking to me, and was just the
Uh,
kindest, gentlest man. so humble and so godly. And, I had a chance a few years ago. I was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I was invited to go and tour Back to the Bible and got to meet some of the staff who like worked for Wiersbe back in the day and got to hear stories of people who went to his church and that worked for him for 20 years and, all that kind of thing. And everyone was unanimous that like he was just the real deal and that he was a godly
Okay.
man and a
Oh,
very
phew.
simple pastor and husband. And
I was like, I
uh,
thought he was legit. So
yeah, he
I'm
was.
glad.
He was legit. And so, but there was the juxtaposition, right? Of you
Right,
have
right,
good
right.
guys like Wiersbe who are the real deal, and then you just have all these fakey folks. And
So
so,
you think you can see him kind of a
that's something
mile
that
away. Yeah.
yeah, that's the thing that was such a difficulty for me to try to get my mind around is you can't just assume because somebody's famous like Wiersbe
Yeah.
that they're bad. You can't assume
Sure,
that
sure.
they've sold out or they're in it for the money or anything like that. Again, just there's some genuinely humble, wonderful people out there.
Well, I could probably tell a similar story about Joel Beeke. I know I met him a couple of times, and he's just like the least remarkable guy in a sense. I mean, he's remarkable. Like I can't think of anybody I would put, higher sort of in my estimation as a godly man.
Yeah,
But you meet him and you talk to him, and he's just like talking to a normal
It's like talking to your grandpa.
guy, like your grandpa, and he's a great pastor, and he's affected thousands of lives.
He came to the first Reformation 500 conference here, I remember, and it was nothing at that point. And
Yeah.
we just had conversations with him.
But,
yeah,
just a juxtaposition, a different conference,
Hmm.
RC Sproul Jr. came, and the guy was like weird and not approachable. And, I don't want to bash people. I really, but the guy's just like got some screws loose. And I think people have seen that over the years that there's just something not a little too arrogant, a little too something, but that humility, I think, is a big selling point for me, right?
yeah,
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 I'm sold on your evaluation there. So,
yeah. Well, I think there's
well,
a few things that I've noted over the years as far as reasons that people get into trouble as Christian leaders. And I have sort of categorized some of these things in my mind. And I think we do see differences. And it is always hard to say, this, therefore that, right?
Hmm.
This, therefore, because of this. That's the difficulty is always making the connections because I don't know that it always follows. Um, but for example, I posted recently about Phillip Yancey, who
Hmm.
was just, it's a little hard to know if he voluntarily came forward with the information or was threatened. I will say,
sure.
I know generally speaking, how those things go down is that somebody gets a hold of the information
Sure.
and there's a blackmail and extortion situation happening behind the scenes, usually
Right.
involving a lot of money. And so it's like, I
Yeah.
have this
Well, he
information
sold
on you.
millions of books,
Um,
right?
I can prove it and I'll go public with this unless you give me $500,000. The person usually doesn't want to be extorted. And so they're like, well, I guess I'm going to have to go forward with the information myself to
Yeah.
avoid having the payout. And,
And
usually they've contacted the police in the background and all that kind of thing. But
he's pretty elderly now,
rarely.
right?
Well, he's done as
Yeah,
he's like
Yancey was
close to death.
76, and he
Oh, okay.
also has Parkinson's disease,
Parkinson's. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so he's been married like 55 years,
Hmm.
but he's been having an affair with a married woman for 8 years.
What, and I was unclear. Is that currently or this was previous and has
This
stopped?
was very recent. Yeah, it
Oh,
was
wow.
You know,
apparently
Okay.
it,
recently exposed.
and I want
Mm.
to think like young guys who haven't like grown in the Lord and been sanctified are more you know,
Prone to.
prone to this kind of a sin, but you have these older guys coming out
Yeah, yeah.
uh
Well, so
and
so what
later in
drove
life.
me, I did a post about this with Yancey, and this is my summation. If you go back and look over 30 years of Yancey, some of his most popular books are like "What's So Amazing About Grace," "The Jesus I
Hmm.
Never Knew," which now I'm
Oh
starting to
yeah.
think that title was really apropos, right? Because like
Hmm.
I don't know if he really knew Jesus, but um, but he had this kind of sloppy grace, cheap grace kind of message, right?
Right.
And so, what's driving that? I know he was raised in a fundamentalist home, severely rejected all of that, reactionary against all of that. but he's been LGBTQ affirming for a long time and
Oh,
has
Which I had no
participated.
idea.
Yeah, he's participated in this thing called the Wild Goose Festival, which is like a Christian Woodstock
Oh
where
my.
all these LGBTQ people go and they celebrate their diversity and so on. And he spent like 3 years. That was like I think 2007, 2008, 2009, back in those days when he was kind of headlining the Wild Goose Festival. So it's and he was senior editor at Christianity Today magazine, and you saw the drift, towards liberalism and progressivism and all that when he was there, which has continued, of course, after he left. But also, just
so I
having
guess
these
you can see the signs coming from a long ways away. If
you
you're
so
if you're
so with
playing with
him,
sexual immorality in that regard, like,
yeah,
affirming of all these other aberrant views, then what's stopping you from, having a girlfriend on the side the last 8 years without, anybody knowing?
yep.
Or
Yeah, and God's grace is will just, God will forgive you, and what's the big deal? And so I think from my viewpoint, I look at that and say, I've seen 20, 25 years of a slippery slope with
Hmm.
Yancey. You see the same thing with like Carl Lentz at Hillsong, where
Hmm.
he's making these statements that, well, I don't know whether homosexuality is a sin. Who am I to judge? Those kinds of things. And then he ends up having an affair with a Muslim woman, right? And so you see this unwillingness to stand on the truth of Scripture and
right.
to call sin sin, or to even acknowledge that something is a sin, like sexual sin. And then you just then see it play out. Another guy that's kind of in this real cheap grace message is Tullian Tavidian, who is Billy
Hmm.
Graham's grandson,
Right.
and he's one of the sloppiest, on his definition of grace and what grace is. It's sort of like this get out of jail free card where God doesn't care
Hmm.
what you do, and he would hate me representing it that way. But I mean, that seems to me like that's his message, right? Is just sort
Right.
Yeah.
of, hey, God just loves everybody, and this real, easygoing, Jesus in the sky who loves everybody kind of message. And he has multiple affairs, and he had taken over D. James Kennedy's church, Coral
Right.
Ridge,
Yeah, it's
in
terrible.
Florida, and then ended up getting booted out of that for having affairs. And so there's guys like those guys who you see the theological drift first,
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
that they won't stand on Scripture. But then you have conservative guys
Right.
theologically,
Hmm.
like the Doug
Steve
Phillips or
Lawson,
the R.C. Sproul Juniors and the Steve
Doug
Lawsons and so
Phillips.
forth, where it's
Yeah.
not their theology that's leading them there, it's just sin, right? And so
Yeah.
I think we
Yeah.
do have to be careful. I think we do have to recognize that a slip in theology can and probably will lead to a lapse in moral living, because
Hmm.
that
Right.
just makes sense. Like if your
Hmm.
belief
You're
system
losing your
has
bearings.
accommodated it, well, why wouldn't you live according to what your beliefs and standards
Yeah.
allow for?
Your
Um,
rudder is already broken. You're adrift,
yep.
so yeah,
Yeah.
you're gonna end up in bad waters.
Yeah, for sure.
You're
But
not gonna
I
survive
think we
it.
also need to recognize that you don't need that you can be theologically sound. The Steve Lawsons and generally speaking, Ravi Zacharias and some of those guys, that I don't think that was what got them there. And so then you step back and say, okay, so what are some of the key components there? Well, you mentioned one earlier of pride.
Hmm.
Pride is prominent, I think, among church leaders and Christian leaders because we're the answer folks.
Hmm.
Yeah.
The people who have the seminary degree, who have the pulpit, who have the microphone, who wrote the book, we're the ones that people always come to and ask us the questions. And so rarely are we in the position of being the student. And
Sure.
so when you're just constantly the go-to guy, the answer guy, it's bad for you. And so for many years of my life, I've avoided church leadership from a personal standpoint because when I'm out 30, 40 weekends a year speaking at a conference and I'm the go-to
Right.
guy, the last thing I need is to come home on Sunday and be the go-to guy again. And
Sure.
Hmm.
so
Right.
I've intentionally been the guy who sits in the congregation with my family and listens to the word of God and sits under the authority of the teaching of the word of God, and
Hmm.
just tried as much as possible to be a guy, just a guy at
Yeah.
my church.
Hmm.
And most of the people in the churches that I've gone to, they don't know what I do for a living. Most people are just like, yeah, I think he's unemployed. I don't know what he does. um,
Yeah.
I'm just a guy, and
That's a lot of kids for being unemployed, I guess.
yeah, they probably think I'm just living off the state or something. But yeah, I know it
Yeah.
comes up a lot of times whenever somebody like is moving or whatever. They're like, "Well, call Israel. He doesn't work."
Yeah. What do you do? I write books. Okay. You know.
Yeah. So, um, but I think that obviously pride is massive, and then there's also lack of accountability.
Hmm.
And I think we see that with people like Bill Gothard, right? That
Hmm.
have built this massive organization with a bunch of yes men around him. And
Yep.
supposedly he has accountability because he has a board. Yeah, but who's on the board and who put them on the board? And,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and so I think that happens an awful lot where there are people who are really not in a local church.
Hmm.
This is huge with Christian musicians.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
would say almost no Christian musicians are actually really part of a local church. And when you're doing, 250 concerts a year, like how can you?
Right.
Because you're just
You're
not
always on the
home.
road. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you're always on the
Right.
road. Some of the better ones, like back in the day, Michael W. Smith took his pastor on the road with him. Like he had a pastor on the bus
Hmm. Hmm.
that
Okay.
traveled, and they had Bible studies every day, and like they had accountability, and they just kind of took it with them on the road. And how many years later, 40 something years later, still married to the same woman, never been in a scandal, and some
Hmm.
of those guys really did take it more seriously, and tried to figure out a way to like have accountability with their local church, even
Right.
when they were on the road. And so,
I think, and that's one of the
but I
points
think
that I,
accountability is a big issue.
that's one of the points I think that really was probably the undoing of Steve Lawson is he's supposedly a teaching elder or something at this church, but then you come to find out he's not even a member of the church and he really doesn't have any accountability and no connection locally to anybody or anything. And so he has to, one of his, action plans is to put myself under accountability. It's like, well, yeah, that absolutely, it's going to purge out the leaven in your life, but it could have been purging out the leaven in your life this whole time, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And
Yeah, for
it could
sure.
have been a great backstop. You can actually call the elders are calling you and saying, hey, how are you doing? Or
Yeah.
you end up with this like maybe ephemeral network of pastors like on the road, but are you accountable to them? Like, no, right? Like
Well, and accountability, like
in a church
in the case of
structure.
Mark
Yeah.
Driscoll, like you said, surrounding himself by people who agree with him or are asked to leave, is what it sounds like to me. And then, yeah,
Yeah.
with Steve Lawson, I know that the whole concept of denominations, a lot of people dislike and or eschew even,
Mhm.
but I mean, it's Rosaria Butterfield that says the safest place for a woman is in a church that's part of a healthy denomination because you have those levels of accountability for her pastor and elders. And then if they get it
Yeah.
wrong, it can
And that's
be
not
appealed.
a surefire solution. There's
I
always
mean,
temptation and
we
sin,
live in a simple world.
but at least you have a system of accountability. So that's what Presbyterians like to beat that drum.
Well, I wasn't just trying to beat the Presbyterian drum, but I was trying to explain that I think
That's how it works. Yeah.
some people think, oh, this church has elders, so there's accountability. But those elders need accountability. Like it's not
Yeah.
just like a few little people checking on each other. Um,
Yeah.
look at
There are
Mark
times
Driscoll's
where that breaks
situation.
down too.
Of course.
And
I'll
that's,
share. I'll
yeah.
share one example of just a breakdown with that. I had some relatives who were part of an OPC church, and they found out that the pastor was plagiarizing Martin Lloyd Jones, like chapters. Just
I believe it.
lifting sermons word for word. And so
Wow.
they went to the elder board and they said, "Hey, this is going on, and we're concerned about this." And the elders basically said, "You're bringing an accusation against an elder, and this to us speaks of your heart, and that there's sin in your heart." And like, just they were yes men, right? So they
But
basically
he,
said,
but actually, they don't have any power over the pastor, the elders. He has to go to the presbytery. So keep going.
Yeah. So what they said is they said we think you should leave, and that basically you're not
Yeah,
a
they
good fit
don't.
here. So they
They lit.
left. They joined a United Reformed Church.
Hmm.
What is it?
URC.
URC. Yeah, they
You,
joined a URC
Yeah.
church, and so then they tried to go above them to the session, and the session said we can't hear an accusation because you're not a member, and so they wouldn't listen to it. So the guy's still in place, last I knew, at this OPC after a plagiarism issue
well,
that
the
had been going on
elders,
for a
they're
long time.
the funny thing is that we're in the Bible Presbyterian Church. We're the sister denomination for the OPC. We had our fight between us about 100 years ago, but so our polity is the exact same. Uh, the elders have no say. If there's a accusation against the
An
pastor,
elder or a pastor.
the elders of that particular church can do nothing. All they can say is, "All right, well, we recommend you go to presbytery because that's the original court of trying a pastor, right?
So
Yeah.
I think what Israel was saying is they were trying to block it before it went to presbytery.
But they can't do that.
I know
They
they
can't
can't,
actually
but
block it. But what they should have done was facilitate. There's actually a
Yeah, in
guy
this
in
case, they
our
kind of
church would have,
provided a buffer to protect the pastor and
yeah,
said, we think you should leave. And then
right.
upon leaving, there wasn't any recourse for it to be dealt with. And so,
yeah,
I throw that out there to say that
that
I
was
appreciate
incorrect
the
what they did.
structure because
Yep.
when it works, then it, takes care of these kinds of situations. But there are some times where there's a breakdown, even with a structure in place, because
Yep.
again, you have yes men, you have people who
Yeah,
maybe rule by intimidation, and
Yep.
there's fear
right, right, right.
and all of that. And so, there can just be a surprising amount of rot that happens within
Hmm.
the Christian
Sure.
world. And
Yep.
it's devastating, it's heartbreaking. It seems to me that there's a certain level with these Christian celebrities of popularity and money that goes to their head and they think they're invincible. Because it seems like there are pastors who, are successful in fairly large churches and all of that. But there seems to be like when you get to a certain money level and a certain fame level, you're just way more susceptible. And on
Hmm.
one level, I don't know entirely why that would be, um, but it seems to correlate. And I think
Yeah.
maybe what it is that maybe they can think they can pay off people or get rid of them with non-disclosure agreements and out of court settlements, and I know that happens probably way more than what we even know.
Then we
Well, if
realize.
they're,
People
I
just
mean,
get paid to be quiet.
let's just say they're tithing. There is a real threat in people's hearts in church leaders' hearts to overlook somebody who's tithing, say, well, that's a good sign, and they must be doing everything right. Well, it might just mean they have a lot of money to to put out, and
Yeah.
not that that's a surefire sign, but I would say that you're more likely to look at Phillip Yancey and say, well, he gives a lot of money to the church, so we're just not going to bother him.
Yeah, it could
So
it could be. It
that
could
could be
be.
part of it.
Yeah, I just
There
think
was
about
a
like yeah, go ahead.
there was an elder in a church. He was up given the prayer Sunday evening, and he prayed. This is a Presbyterian, a very conservative Presbyterian church. He prayed that he and his wife would be together, married, have a celestial marriage, for eternity with God, and how much you look forward to that. And I was thinking, somebody's got to, tell this guy that this is terrible theology. And I hope somebody did, but he was the biggest donor and he let everybody know it to the church. He was a millionaire and gave lots of money.
Wow.
And he was the top dog in the elder board and everything,
You
according to
get to slip
him.
Mormon theology in if you have enough money, huh?
I know, and this is like a very like robust like theological church.
I mean, graciously, I maybe it was a slip of the tongue and he didn't really intend it, but
Yeah,
it was. I was there. I was taken aback. So
yeah,
Yeah.
no, it
he
was.
just. I don't know.
I think when you have a lot of influence in the church, or in one way or another, there's a tendency to not hold those men to an account. Ian
Yeah.
Hamilton testified in
Yes.
my pastoral theology class of a professor
Mm.
at at RTS Jackson. He did a pastoral visitation in his house. The guy broke down in tears and he's like, "Oh no, what sin am I about to uncover?" And he says, "You're the first pastor to call on me in like 20 or 30 years."
Because
It's
this
like, I think there's a
the
sense
professor, a position of prominence, so he wasn't being shepherded
he
well.
wasn't being shepherded because he was too influential. And that's
That's
just
so sad.
sad that we think of important people as too important to actually shepherd and
That's
Well, I
actually
would
what
be
I
that way with
was,
I'd be that way if Ravi Zacharias was in my church. I'd be
right.
like,
That's
oh,
what I
yeah.
was thinking, you
You
know.
know, like how stupid would
Um,
that be for me to go try to presume he needs shepherding? You know, like if I'm the
yeah.
pastor,
yeah,
I'd be like, yeah,
except he
nah, he's
does,
good.
you know. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I actually wonder, I don't know if you want to comment on Josh Harris, but
Mm.
I've only seen that from afar, right? Like Instagram, you know, the the
Yeah,
the
tell us the
whole train
up
wreck.
close and personal.
And I wonder if
What do you think?
that literally was what happened with someone like him, where he's the pastor and he's not being shepherded by other pastors. I mean, I'm sure there's much more. I'm not trying to oversimplify it,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that's what we have seen, and like what Ian Hamilton taught you in your class is if someone's in your church, the command "feed my sheep" is equal
For
to all of
everybody.
them.
Yeah.
yeah. With Josh Harris, so C.J. Mahaney was the founder of the Sovereign Grace movement,
Right.
and he was the pastor in charge of the church that Josh took over, which was kind of like the flagship church there in Maryland. And they had a sexual scandal in that
Mhm.
denomination. That's been a while, so I don't remember all the details very clearly. But I think the idea was that there had been people who were sexually abused, maybe some kids, and that the pastors didn't report it to the authorities. And this is like back in
Sounds
the
like the
90s.
CREC situation.
And so,
Yeah.
this was like back in the 90s, and it just didn't come out for like 20 years.
Oh, okay.
So Josh was at the helm when the scandal broke.
Okay.
Um, and so what shook him, at least this is kind of his testimony of it, was that he's like, well, if these people knew about it, why didn't they go to the authorities? And then why was there kind of a cover up? And why was it that nobody wanted to? It wasn't like the pastors were the predators, but
Perpetrators.
there were
Yeah, or the predator.
people in the
Yeah.
church that had done things, and so I guess the idea was we just don't want the scandal, we don't want the negative publicity, so let's just kind of keep it under wraps. And
Right.
yeah, I think a lot of churches dealt with that way back in the day.
Hmm.
And so he got disillusioned and just said, well, maybe if I knew more about church leadership, I would be able to handle things like this better. I'm going to go to seminary. Went out to Vancouver to the school in British Columbia, I think it was, where Packer was on staff. I can't remember the name of the
Oh,
school,
yes.
Yeah,
but they
Packers
tended
Yeah.
to lean a little bit
seminary.
left.
Yeah.
Yeah, even though Packer was associated with it, they tended to lean a little bit left, and it
Mm.
just seemed like he kind of unraveled once he got out there.
Interesting.
So there's
I don't
probably a lot
want
of
to besmirch
factors,
all
but
the Anglicans, but Anglicans tend to be attract a left-leaning attitude, I think. Uh, they're not
yeah,
necessarily leftist, but they try to be quote unquote apolitical, but
yeah,
then they're the official state church of a country. So
yeah,
um well, yeah, that's interesting. So you have a little bit that's a little bit more sympathetic view of like he had a reason an event that happened in his life that kind of made him unravel a little bit and then
yeah. That would be his testimony of it. I think there probably are other layers to it as well. It was interesting with Josh and I is that I think he's maybe 6 months older than I am. We're pretty close in age. His dad was a founder of the homeschooling movement. My mom was a
Hmm.
founder of the homeschooling
Hmm.
movement. We both started speaking at conferences about the same time. People kind of compared us. In fact, I remember there was an article in New American Magazine that had come out in goodness late '90s. Harris is a real like radical conservative, but compared to Israel Wayne makes him look like a liberal, which was kind of funny.
That is
Um,
funny. That's
wow.
funny.
but so yeah, we never became buddies. He didn't, I reached out to him a couple of times. He didn't seem like he wanted to connect, but
Let's switch over to the Mark Driscoll. I feel like
I think you were saying that we kind of did the big picture, and maybe
yeah, we
you want
did
to
big
focus
picture.
more.
we've
granularly on that situation?
yeah,
You've got it over there on that screen, I think.
let's go a little deeper into this blog post. I'm going to call it a blog post. It was a Facebook post, maybe it was a blog post too, about Mark Driscoll.
Mhm.
And I think the gist of what you're saying here is kind of what you've already said. Is like you with some of these other guys, you could see it coming a million miles away, starting in 1990. Detailing not every year, but sometimes there's a gap, 5 years here, 5 years there. But you detail from 90 to 2025 over about 35 years of indiscretions, not
Dishonesty.
Yeah, I think
dishonesty,
that's what's
patterns of character flaws that, not just like besetting sins that would characterize anybody. Like I said earlier, but it's preaching through Genesis and Abraham, at 75, the man of God, chosen by God,
and the
is
same thing
sinning, and
twice
and
with his wife.
it seems like everybody had, the scriptures make very clear that there's every holy man has, an Achilles heel, right? That there's
Mhm.
not that there's like these are perfect people that are just shiny and stellar and have no sin, but that there's certain egregious things that people do that probably just put you outside even of a secular evaluation of what leadership should look like, right? Um,
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's what struck me most when I saw this post, and I think I would read it to you while we were driving, and just the fact that I don't know, some of the people we've talked about, it's like one sin or one instance that we know about.
Mhm.
But I've read one of Driscoll's books and I'd heard, oh, he's the edgy pastor because of the language he uses or whatever. But what I really took away was just like you laid out this pattern of multiple different, dishonesty, plagiarism, not guarding his mouth properly, you know, on and on and
Abusive
on.
church, like
Uh,
physical
yeah.
assault of people in his
Physical
church.
assault. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Bad
verbal,
choice of
physical. Yeah.
friends. Yeah. I mean, him and James McDonald were both on the Elephant Room trying to convince everybody that T.D. Jakes was a Trinitarian.
Yeah. Yeah. It just,
And
I guess
then
that
talk
really
about
struck
scandals,
me,
like
this
all three guys
broad.
have had scandal after scandal. Um, and so the one thing that struck me though about Mark Driscoll was when I was reading a book by him or listening to a message by him, and he made the comment that the very first church that he was ever a member of. Yeah, that's correct. And so he had never been a member of a church before he became the senior pastor of a church. And so what that speaks to me is this is a man who has not had any litmus test at all in terms of
Mhm.
him being biblically qualified to be in leadership. And this is a case where I'm indicting myself amidst everybody else that I'm going to throw under the bus right now because I
all of
primarily work in
America.
I would primarily work in what would be considered a parachurch organization. Family Renewal, which is the organization that I started, is actually a for-profit. It gives this facade of legitimacy when you're a 501c3,
Mhm.
but in
It costs
reality,
$700 to get that facade. So
right, and you have more paperwork and things like that. But there's reasons why I didn't go down that path for what I'm doing. One of which is I actually don't want to be muzzled, and like you have to create a board which supposedly provides you with accountability, but you can be thrown out of the organization that you founded.
Mhm.
Not to drop names, but a certain guy in Colorado who had a very large ministry focusing on family
Mhm.
ended up being removed from the organization he started by his board, and he
Yeah.
wasn't in
And
sin or
not
at
for any
fault.
more, not for moral failure or any
He was
legitimate
too
reason.
strong on the
Yeah.
issues from a biblical
Hmm.
standpoint than the
Yeah.
organization felt comfortable with. And so, but my point is, so I think it's just so easy to become an influencer now.
Hmm.
Um, and
Oh,
I'm
I
thinking,
know.
especially like in the homeschool world in which I live, I'm thinking that's more influence than like probably 20 or 30 state homeschool organizations put together.
It's unreal.
For sure. And
It's
it's like,
really
I've never
terrifying,
heard of this woman.
honestly.
She's 23 years old and she's got like a 2-year old and she's telling everybody how to homeschool. I'm not thinking of anybody in particular. I'm just, caricaturing. But it's a reality. And so it's very easy, I think, for people to become influencers without having any credibility, without having any background, without having
Hmm.
any uh, formal theological training, without having any board that they're accountable to. And
Hmm.
I
I'm
mean, talk
kind of
about
in
it.
that camp, right?
I
I
mean,
didn't go to seminary and, you know,
I'm guessing most of those people who are on YouTube, it's just they have good personalities, which I could
they know how to
never be
market.
accused of this.
Hmm.
Or you're good at like editing videos, like you just know
Yeah,
how to like put a funny little meme together and it
for
just
sure.
resonates with people, you
Sure.
know. But does that qualify to be, you know,
A Christian
are
leader.
you even a church member? Do you even go to church? Are
Exactly.
you just getting out? I actually just came across this guy because I'm one of these guys that watches YouTube shorts. This guy
Mhm.
has not to sound rude, but he almost looks homeless, which he probably is next to homeless. He's missing like a bunch of teeth, and he comes on and does inspirational quotes, which not even Christian, but this guy's getting thousands of views and likes and all kinds of stuff, and I'm like, he has this kind of a sweet sort of personality, but he just looks like the most ratty, like unpresentable guy. But because
Yeah.
he comes off with sincerity, like there's a little bit of
But
personality.
you're saying it's baffling.
But it's baffling. I think it's
Yeah.
fascinating, maybe. And those are the kind of people who are just like, we don't even know anything about
And the
them.
masses are just listening to this
It,
and following
you're
it.
just able to catch somebody's attention for more than 15 seconds, right? So
Yeah.
yeah,
So
and it's
like I'm
getting
I'm
maybe
including myself
worse.
in that too, right? Because I don't have a seminary degree. I don't have some church that's rubber stamped what I do and says, "Oh, Israel, we agree with you. You need to go out there and convince everybody to like get their kids out of the government schools and give them a Christian education." Like nobody's championing that. Like I'm kind of out here on my own, oftentimes not having the approval of churches. Oftentimes having people say what I'm doing is illegitimate and I should quit. I want to be careful because I'm doing something. I'm not trying to just throw all of this out and say, oh, none of it has validity. But I think it's dangerous, right? That any of us can just kind of go out and live on the conference circuit. People don't know me. They don't know my wife. They don't
Hmm.
know my kids. They don't know how I
Hmm.
treat my wife and kids at home. I can go to parenting seminars, parenting conferences, write books. What do they know about me? What do they know about my family? What access do they have to that information? Do they know if I'm attending a church? And, so there's a bit of anonymity, I think, that kind of lifestyle affords, whether it's all the social media front or even out there on the conference circuit. There's not a ton of accountability that happens out there. But I'll go beyond that and say the people who are kind of snooty about, well, we're all for local church ministry. I've kind of made a living traveling around speaking in churches as well. Most of the people who are in church leadership don't know that First Timothy 3 and Titus 1 are a thing. Never heard of it. Like they got hired on the
Wow.
basis of their seminary degree and 2 sermons when they candidated. That's it.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I remember talking to a guy. I was at a conference in Louisville, Kentucky, and I met a guy who came to my seminar. It was a seminar I did, and I talked to him afterward, and he told me he was going to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Al Mohler, and all
Hmm.
those guys,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so
Hmm.
I said, hey, what do you think of the school? And he's like, oh, they have great classes, and I'm really enjoying it. Well, I saw this same guy a few years later out west, somewhere kind of probably out your area. I don't remember
Hmm.
exactly if it was Boise or where it was, but somewhere out there.
Hmm.
And I remembered it. I don't usually, but I do. And I did that time. And I said, so what do you do? And he said, well, I'm a senior pastor now at this Southern Baptist church out here. And I said, so what did you think of your experience at the seminary? Now that you've been all the way through the seminary, whatever, do you still have the same positive perspective of it? And he said, it's interesting because he said I feel like he was there 4 years. Would you do 4 years at a seminary?
Hmm. Usually
Okay.
Three or
3 or
four,
4. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think
depending
he
on the
said four
seminary.
years. So I think he said 4 years, but he said at the 4 years that I was at the seminary, I had a lot of great classes, a lot of great professors, learned a lot of things, good theology, learned many good things. But he said in those 4 years, not one professor or anybody on staff, nobody in the administration ever asked me about my marriage or about my kids. Never
Wow.
came up. And then he said, then this church, they hired me on the basis of I got a degree from this seminary that they respect. And when I
Hmm.
candidated, I preached 2 sermons. And he said the first time they ever met my wife and children, I was the senior pastor of that church. They'd already hired me and they had
Wow.
never met my wife and kids. And he said, here's
Oh,
the thing that I think about. He said, having a seminary degree is not a biblical prerequisite for being
right.
a pastor. But having your house in order is, and nobody ever asked me about that.
Hmm.
And so he said, it just feels to me like somehow as churches, we have our priorities off. And he said, I'm not
Hmm.
against seminary. Obviously, I spent 4 years of my life there. I wouldn't have done that if I believed that it was worthless and that, there's no value to that. And, he said, I feel like I got a lot of great information, which is good. But in terms of me being qualified to lead a church, he said, nobody ever asked me about my finances. Nobody really found out like my background as far as any character significant character references or like
Wow.
conflict resolution.
Yeah, that's
Like how is
interesting.
this guy in situations where what happens when he gets bumped, there's just. And
Hmm.
he said there's just so many things that I feel like the scriptures have a pretty high bar and all
Right.
that got skipped over. And he goes, it just feels like something's broken in the system. So I think I hear a lot of times from pastors that they're like questioning the validity of something like what I do as an itinerant speaker, independent author. And I get that. I think there's some reasons to be skeptical of all of that. That's outside of local church and that's, maybe somebody off doing their own thing. I get why they're skeptical of that. But in fairness, I also kind of look over and go, but I can guarantee you most of the
What are the
pastors
churches
in the
doing?
States,
Yeah.
they're not meeting any kind of biblical criteria for the
Right.
things that are scripturally required. And so I
I
think that's why
agree.
we see a
Yeah.
lot of these mega church pastors who have scandals, as well as the people who are out on the road traveling every weekend, because there's character flaws and there's really not a biblically founded litmus test that says this person gets to be in this position and this person does not.
Yeah.
And even
Well,
like
to
not being a novice, right? I mean, Mark Driscoll's a
yeah.
senior pastor the first day he's a member. That's a
Yeah, he's a
novice.
novice. Don't lay your hands on a man too quickly. That's a good point. Yeah, no, I have a couple of responses. It's true. You can beat up, celebrity culture, and the cult of personality, and there's some legitimacy to that. But, these little pastors of these little churches, we just had a Sovereign Grace Church blow up because the guy got caught generating the
AI
AI versions of images of children.
underage. Yeah.
And I'll
Oh,
just give a little detail because it's bizarre. Idaho just passed a law against AI generated images, and he used images of people who were of age and reverse
Reverse time.
time or something. Anyway,
hmm.
so he's now in prison, but it's just a little no-name church, and it perfectly describes what you just said. Is that there were a couple of guys. I had lunch with the other guy who were in the congregation. One thought he was going to be the pastor, but they chose this other guy instead, inexplicably, and hadn't had any pastoral experience before. But is that an example? The guy wasn't young. Is it an example of laying hands on a man too quickly at 25, like Mark Driscoll? No, but I will say that that guy, that was a Baptist SBC pastor. I'm actually a little surprised
Could be
because
too.
I thought the SBC churches in general had like an ordination process or a process of vetting people, more like the Presbyterians do, but maybe it's not as rigorous. But we have ministerial data information forms where we have to fill out like what do your family devotions look like, what do your personal devotions look like, and this is if you're not a new candidate as for a new pastor, but if you're like transferring in, you even have to fill this stuff out.
I
So,
will say,
and they will, and they do ask you. At our seminary, they asked us monthly. We went to lunch with a professor, and they would ask us about pornography. You know,
mhm,
when's the last time you looked at it, if at all? Um,
they didn't shy away from that.
and tell
And
me
they,
about your family devotions and personal
and I
devotions.
believe I had to write
We had prayer
for you to
meetings.
even get in seminary. I think I had to write about our relationship or my testimony, I think, in our relationship.
Probably, yeah.
So I am thankful that Greenville and some seminaries
They should,
don't shy away from that.
even though the wives are not up for being like the guy, the pastor. I think there was one call when I was in seminary. I considered a call to a church, and I think the pulpit search committee wanted to have a Zoom meeting with her, like not to ask her like
Not to grill me on theological
real or
questions,
theologically, but
but
just to talk to her, get to know you. And
yeah.
I can't remember what the questions were, but at least they tried to do something with the wife.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think those are
But
all really good points. And are any of our churches doing that? I think they easily could. They easily could. Like,
Well,
it's
there's
not that
another
hard.
thing with pastors, right? That part of my thing as an itinerant pastor, I go speak, I speak at churches, and then afterward they take me out to lunch, and it's me and the
mhm,
pastor, usually alone, having a lunch, and they just dump, they just pour their heart out, and like I'm
Wow.
leaving, you know. So I'm a safe space because I don't know anybody in their church,
mhm,
Oh, you're
and they
gonna
can
go
just
away.
offload, and
mhm,
so I love that I'm a safe space, but I can tell with so many of them they don't have anybody to talk to.
mhm.
uh, I've read some statistics. Pastors' wives have almost no friends. Pastors feel like they
Wouldn't
have
doubt it.
nobody they can talk to, and
Mhm,
so there's an isolation, there's a loneliness that
mhm,
happens within the pastoral ministry as well, where again you're the go-to person, you're the output person, and it's just give, 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 give. And you can't be a real person, and you can't let your guard down, and you have all this stuff that you have to have confidentiality about everybody's stuff, in the church. And but like, where do you go when you're burnout, or where you're struggling with
Yeah.
resentment or anger, or you and your spouse aren't getting along, and who do you tell about that? And so pastoral work, I think, is very lonely as well. And so there's a lot of places where I've found, um, for it's kind of the same for all of us. If you're just a regular Christian, you have to seek out accountability, right? If you're a Christian leader, you have to seek out accountability. There's none provided for you. You have to go
mhm.
Right.
find it. You have to make it. You have to create it.
Sure.
If you're a church leader, like, you have to want it, and you have to go try to find that and manufacture it somehow. And
Sure.
it's hard. One of the things that I did back in 2000, I started family renewal in 2013. By 2014, we'd had some big scandals. There was the Doug Phillips scandal. There was
Mhm.
the Bill Gothard scandal. And I remember talking to my wife, and I said, I just feel like, I'm attending a little church, but I don't know that I really have real accountability in my life.
Mhm. Mhm.
I don't know if that's actually there for me. And so I feel like it needs to be. And so she said, well, what do you feel like you should do? I said, well, let me pray about it, see if I can come up with something. So prayed about it for a while, and I went and talked to my pastor, and I said, hey, do you have some thoughts on this? Because I just feel like, I'm out on the road, and I don't feel like I'm really high risk. Probably nobody does. But at the same point, what would happen if I start teaching falsehood, or I start living inconsistently? Just, is there a system in place where I could have somebody? I said, here's what I want. I want to create a self-destruct mechanism that basically I can get yanked if I need it.
Yeah.
And so we talked about it, and he said, well, within the local church, you would have that here. Like, if there's something going on in your family, they
They
could come
kick
to
you out.
us,
Yeah.
and
Right.
we could exercise church discipline. So you have that here, but we don't know what you do out on the road. We don't know the people, and we don't
Right.
know that world. He said, do you think you could link that world a little bit? And so I thought about three guys who were out on the road doing what I did, that were older than me, that were respected, had been in ministry or church leadership or pastors or whatever for many, many years, but godly, solid, men who often I'd see every other weekend, because we're out on the same circuit. And so I patched these three guys together in an email. And I said, hey, I just want you guys to know, like, I'm asking if you would be kind of an accountability board for me. And then here's my pastor's email. Here's his phone number.
Hmm.
I carbon copied him on the email and said, so here's how this works. If I'm out on the conferences and I'm, treating people badly and I'm being arrogant or I'm teaching heresy or I'm doing something that out on the road that is inconsistent with my profession, you need to contact my local church.
Yeah.
And and I think I carbon copied my sister and my wife, who were working with me at the time, and they were in on the email too. And I said, so if I'm not being who I'm supposed to be at home, they'll contact my local church. My local church will contact you guys, and you guys go public with it to all the state organizations and everybody that I work with. And, basically you need to shut me down if my church is say, if I'm under church discipline,
Hmm.
so that I can't just keep doing this as a
Hmm.
living if I'm under church discipline privately at home.
Right.
So my pastor will let you know and you guys shut me down. But at the same point, if I'm doing something on the road, that gets reported back to my local church, and then my local church can deal with me. And so I
Hmm.
made this loop between my home, my local church, and my public ministry with people who were out there doing the same thing I was, and that I knew cared enough about me that they would probably confront me first. But if it was just unrepentant or whatever, that there was a mechanism to just I put a self-destruct mechanism in place. And that was something I had to come up with
Right.
because nothing like that is innate. And I think there's just a
Yeah.
trust level that
We
people
we
have
really
that,
abdicated we really abdicated the keys of the kingdom in Matthew 16 and the church discipline, I feel like just means like we ostracize people, whenever something happens and they can just go to some other church and
right.
we've eviscerated biblical because we say, well, Matthew 16 is about the Roman church. It's not about us. It's like, well, that's not entirely true at all because it was written before the Roman church existed by the apostles. So I think the keys of the kingdom are important. We need to bind and bind evil and the church discipline. Is something I'm so appreciative of. It's actually why we're Presbyterian. People are shocked. I go to these pastor meetings in our town, and there's a couple of there's one Reformed Baptist, and then there's me, the right wing crazy confessional Presbyterian old school guy, and they we're all telling our stories, and half of the guys, or if not more, like three-quarters of the guys grew up in the Assemblies of God, and now
Hmm.
they're in all these different Methodist type denominations or whatever. And I said, well, me too, so, but that's what I'm not like Presbyterian by anything, but choice that this is a safe place. Do Presbyterians like go apostate? Yeah, but that's right. We need that self-destruct button. Like
Hmm.
that there's another bunch of pastors out there who are checking in on us. I've got pastors, retired pastors and regular pastors checking in on me regularly. And yeah, it's lonely. It doesn't go well. That's when you need like some brothers to call you and you can just say, my brother, like this week I had a hard time with somebody at church giving me the third degree about my sermon, and like
Yeah.
somebody to you can actually call and unload to, and
Yeah.
so you speak to them on a regular basis, and you have a relationship, right? I love that you tied into those guys you're seeing like fairly regularly. That's
But
great.
that right there is like the difference between, Mark or anybody that we've been talking about and you or others that have been self-aware, aware of their sin and said, how are we going to bridge the gap here?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Um,
also that ties in very much with, I think, personal holiness,
mhm,
because your
mhm,
relationship with Christ has to mean something to you.
right.
And so there's another part of this too, is that there's a very common mistake that Christian leaders make where they think they can substitute Christian service for spiritual disciplines
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
because they're working for Jesus. And
Right.
so it's very easy to avoid daily Bible time, to avoid
Mm-hmm.
prayer, to avoid, just like, again, like accountability in your local church, to avoid, um, fasting, or just avoid the things that are good for us.
Sure.
Why? Because we're working so much, and we're
Right.
we're
Mm-hmm.
writing, so like I'm preparing sermons, or I'm writing theological books. So why would I need to read the Bible devotionally,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Right.
And so I think
Exactly
this
right.
is a
Yep.
huge problem with Christian leaders. You hear the Christian musicians say it the most. Usually when
Mm-hmm.
they crash and burn, they're like, I wasn't reading my Bible, I wasn't praying, I wasn't in church, I just was wearing myself out. And I thought because I was singing songs about Jesus that was a replacement for like reading my Bible. But
Right.
I also know, I've seen some studies on this, that most pastors don't ever read their Bible apart from sermon prep.
Right.
And so there's a danger there. So I think some of it really comes down to the issue of our own personal walk with Christ, and that meaning something to us, and having those kinds of things in place in our life that we do ourselves, without necessarily having somebody having to look in on us. That
Mm-hmm.
those are just part of our life. It's part of what we do. It's part of our practice. And I'm really thankful that God did not allow me to have any fast success, and He didn't allow me to have any really big success. I
Mm-hmm.
just kind of been out here for 30 years plugging away, just kind of doing
I
doing
mean,
my
I guess
work.
it depends on how you define big, but yeah, it's true. The whole celebrity. I mean, I think you've had a big influence in homeschooling and Christian worldview, apologetics, but
If you would just pay us to be your marketing team, we could get you on the New York Times bestseller list.